There is a word that every functioning government on Earth uses to describe itself. Democracies, democratic republics, people's democratic republics. The word is Greek. It was invented in this city, on this hill, in the 5th century before the Common Era. But the word is not the achievement. The achievement is what happened after the city that invented it was militarily destroyed, economically strangled, and stripped of every physical advantage it had ever possessed. Because that is when Athens did something no city in the ancient world had ever done before. It turned its mind into its principal export. And it has been collecting on that export for 25 centuries. The Roman generals who conquered Athens sent their sons here to study. The Arab scholars who preserved Greek texts during Europe's dark centuries were transmitting Athenian intellectual infrastructure. The founding fathers of the United States built their constitutional architecture on frameworks first assembled in this city. Athens lost every war that mattered. It won every century that followed. To understand how that is possible, you have to start not with the philosophy. You have to start with the silver. Every city in this series has a mechanism, a specific function that kept it alive across centuries of pressure. Athens has two. The first mechanism was hardware, the port of Piraeus, the silver mines of Laurion, the long walls connecting the city to the sea, and the naval fleet those silver mines financed. This was the physical infrastructure of Athenian power. It was built in 2 generations, dominated the Aegean for 70 years, and was dismantled by Sparta in 404 BC in a single season. The second mechanism was software, the academy, the lyceum, the schools of rhetoric and philosophy that Athens built, mostly after the military defeat, and that transformed the city from a political power into an intellectual one. This mechanism was never dismantled. It could not be. You cannot knock down an idea with a battering ram. The question this episode answers is not which mechanism was more important. The question is why Athens built the software at all, and why it turned out to be, by an enormous margin, the more durable of the two. The answer begins with a geography that almost no one considers when they think about Athens. It begins 8 kilometers from the Acropolis, at sea level, where the smell is salt and diesel and old fish. It begins at Piraeus. Athens made no agricultural sense. Attica, the territory Athens controlled, is rocky, thin-soiled, and receives less rainfall than most of its Mediterranean neighbors. It could not feed itself at the population levels classical Athens required. The grain came from the Black Sea coast, from Egypt, from Sicily, from everywhere except the land beneath the city's feet. This was not a vulnerability. It was a design. A city that cannot feed itself from its own land must control the sea routes that bring its food. A city that controls sea routes becomes necessarily a naval power. A naval power requires silver to build ships. And in 483 BC, Athenian miners broke into a new vein at Laurion that produced more silver than the city had ever seen. The general Themistocles convinced the Athenian assembly to spend the entire windfall, 100 talents of silver, not on a distribution to citizens, which was the expected use, but on a fleet of 200 triremes. A trireme required 200 rowers. 200 triremes required 40,000 men, almost the entire adult male citizen population of Athens, to operate simultaneously. Themistocles had not built a navy. He had reorganized Athenian society around a navy. Every citizen who rowed was economically dependent on the fleet's success. The fleet's success required controlling the sea. Controlling the sea required Piraeus. Piraeus was not Athens's port. Piraeus was Athens's reason for existing. The philosopher Plato, who distrusted the sea and what it did to cities, wrote that the harbor was a dangerous neighbor, that it filled the city with merchants and money and foreign ideas, and drove out the farmers and the soldiers who made a city virtuous. He was right about all of it. He was wrong that it was a problem. Between 480 and 430 BC, Athens built something that had never existed before. A maritime empire financed by tribute and administered through an alliance it had converted into a protection racket. The Delian League began as a voluntary alliance of Greek city-states against Persian invasion. Athens, the dominant naval power, was the natural leader. Member states contributed either ships or money. Athens, gradually and without formal declaration, converted the money contributions into direct tribute to itself, moved the League's treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BC, and used the funds to rebuild the Acropolis. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BC, was paid for by tribute money extorted from Athens' allies. The man who designed this system was Pericles, the dominant political figure of 5th century Athens. He was not a king. He was elected, year after year, by a democratic assembly of citizens. He persuaded them to do what he thought was necessary and stepped down when he failed to persuade. A sculptor named Phidias, who had designed the great statue of Athena inside the Parthenon, was accused in 432 BC of embezzling gold from the project. Pericles, who had been his patron, was unable to protect him. Phidias died in prison awaiting trial. The democracy that had built the most beautiful building in the ancient world prosecuted the man who designed it on a corruption charge. The system worked precisely because it did not exempt anyone. At its peak, the Athenian Empire administered more than 200 tributary states, maintained a fleet of 300 triremes, and held enough silver in its treasury to pay 40,000 citizens' wages for a decade without collecting a single additional drachma. The organism was at maximum hardware capacity, and the hardware was about to meet something it could not outbuild. Between 490 and 400 BC, a city of perhaps 30,000 adult male citizens produced an intellectual output that has not been equaled by any comparable population in recorded history. Aeschylus invented the dramatic form that structured Western theater for 2,000 years. He fought at Marathon before he wrote his plays, the same man, the same generation. Herodotus of Halicarnassus came to Athens and invented history, the systematic inquiry into why human events happen in a city that gave him the audience and the intellectual framework to attempt it. Thucydides, writing his account of the Peloponnesian War from exile after a military failure he did not conceal, produced the first political science text in Western history. His analysis of why democracies make catastrophic military decisions, the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC, which destroyed a third of Athenian military capacity in a single CAMPA-IGN, reads as a diagnostic tool for any political system in any century. He wrote it while Athens was losing the war he was analyzing. Socrates, who wrote nothing, built nothing, charged nothing, and wore the same cloak for 30 years, asked a question that no one before him had asked with such systematic persistence. How do you know what you think you know? The democracy that produced him executed him in 399 BC for corrupting the youth and impiety. He was 70 years old. He had spent 50 years asking questions in public spaces. He accepted the verdict without fleeing, because accepting it was the final argument. The organism was producing knowledge faster than it could apply it, and entirely dependent on the physical infrastructure, the fleet, the tribute, the long walls, that was that same year being dismantled. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years. It began because Sparta's allies feared Athenian expansion and pressured Sparta to act. It ended because Persia, the empire Athens had defeated at Marathon, and Salamis, decided to fund Sparta's navy in exchange for Greek cities on the Anatolian coast. The same Persia. 40 years later, Pericles' strategy was defensively sound. Retreat behind the long walls. Let Sparta devastate the countryside, maintain naval superiority, outlast the invasion. The strategy required Athenians to watch their farms burn from the safety of their walls. It also required Pericles to remain in political control. He died of plague in 429 BC, in the second year of the war. What followed was a democracy without the man who had made it function. Demagogues proposed the Sicilian expedition, an invasion of western Sicily, to open a second front against Sparta's Sicilian allies. The assembly voted for it. A general named Nicias opposed the expedition as reckless, argued against it with detailed analysis of the costs and risks, and was appointed to lead it as a compromise. He led it. He failed. He was captured and executed by the Syracusans. Athens lost 200 ships and 40,000 men in Sicily between 415 and 413 BC. It still did not surrender. It reorganized, rebuilt a fleet, continued fighting for 9 more years. That persistence is not what matters. What matters is what happened in 404 BC, when Sparta finally cut off Athens' grain supply from the Black Sea, and the city, which could not feed itself from its own land, had to accept terms. The long walls were demolished to the sound of flutes. The fleet was reduced to 12 ships. The silver mines, still operating, were no longer protected by a navy. The hardware was gone. And that is when Athens discovered what it had actually been building all along. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The terms were specific and deliberately humiliating. The long walls, 6 kilometers of fortification, connecting the city to Piraeus, were demolished. The Athenian fleet was reduced to 12 triremes. The overseas empire dissolved. The tribute stopped. The treasury, which had held 6,000 talents of silver at its peak, was empty. Sparta installed a pro-Spartan oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, who governed Athens for 8 months of summary executions and property confiscation before a democratic resistance, led by a general named Thrasybulus, removed them. Democracy was restored in 403 BC. The city that restored it had no fleet, no tribute income, no long walls, and no empire. What it had was the agora, still functioning. The theater of Dionysus, still producing plays. The workshops of potters and sculptors who had been selling Athenian craftsmanship across the Mediterranean for a century. And an intellectual reputation, built by 50 years of Aeschylus, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Socrates, that no Spartan army could demolish with picks and levers. A man named Plato was 24 years old when Athens surrendered. He had watched the 30 tyrants operate. He had watched his mentor Socrates executed by the restored democracy 5 years later, in 399 B.C. He left Athens. He traveled to Megara, to Egypt, to Sicily, where he tried and failed to turn a tyrant into a philosopher king. He returned to Athens in 387 BC. And in a grove sacred to the hero Academos, outside the city walls, he opened a school. He charged no tuition. He taught geometry, mathematics, philosophy, and political theory. He called it the Academy. The hardware was gone. The software had just booted up. Plato taught at the Academy for 40 years, until his death in 347 BC. Among his students was a young man from Stagira, in Macedonia, who arrived at age 17 and stayed for 20 years. Aristotle was not a passive student. He disagreed with Plato on the most fundamental questions, on the nature of reality, on the purpose of political systems, on whether mathematics or empirical observation was the better path to knowledge. He stayed anyway, because Athens was the only place in the world where the disagreement could be conducted at this level. When Plato died, Aristotle was not appointed to lead the Academy, perhaps because of his foreign birth, perhaps because of his philosophical disagreements. He left. He was hired as a tutor for the 13-year-old son of Philip, II of Macedonia. The boy's name was Alexander. Aristotle taught Alexander for 3 years. What he taught is imperfectly documented, but the results are measurable. Alexander carried a copy of Homer annotated by Aristotle on his campaigns. He founded the Library of Alexandria, the most ambitious knowledge preservation project in the ancient world, partly in the intellectual tradition his tutor had modeled. He brought Greek intellectual culture to Persia, Egypt, and the edges of India. Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BC and opened his own school, the Lyceum, 1 kilometer from the academy, in a grove with a covered walkway where he taught while walking. His students were called the Peripatetics, the walkers. He produced in 13 years at the Lyceum foundational texts in logic, biology, physics, ethics, politics, poetics, and rhetoric that remained the primary intellectual framework of Western and Islamic civilization for 1,500 years. A man who had been a student in a defeated city built the intellectual operating system of the known world. He could not have done it anywhere else, because nowhere else had the infrastructure, the accumulated intellectual tradition, the critical mass of scholars, the physical space for disagreement that Athens had been building, mostly by accident, for a century before the walls came down. By the 3rd century BC, Athens had worked out what it was for. It was a university city. The 4 major philosophical schools, the Academy, the Lyceum, the Garden of Epicurus, and the Stoa founded by Zeno of Citium, operated simultaneously within walking distance of each other. Each offered a complete system, not just a set of ideas, but a way of living, a community, and a framework for understanding everything from physics to politics to the best way to die. Students came from across the Mediterranean world. They came from Macedonia, from Egypt, from the Italian peninsula, from Asia Minor, from Carthage. They paid in various forms, tuition, endowments, donations, political favors, to access the accumulated intellectual infrastructure that Athens had built over 2 centuries. The city that had once collected tribute by threat of naval force was now collecting intellectual tribute by reputation. The mechanism had inverted. Epicurus, who founded his school in 306 BC in a garden outside the city walls, admitted women and slaves to his lectures, a radical act in a city whose democracy had excluded both. His philosophy argued that the goal of life was the absence of pain and anxiety, achievable through simple living and philosophical friendship. He was accused by enemies of licentiousness. His school lasted 500 years. Zeno of Citium, a Phoenician merchant's son from Cyprus, not an Athenian, founded the Stoic school around 300 BC in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, in the Agora. His philosophy argued that virtue was the only good, that emotion was a failure of reason, and that the wise man was free regardless of his external circumstances. The Stoics produced Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, a former slave, and Seneca. They produced a framework for enduring hardship that Roman emperors and American prisoners of war have both explicitly cited. A Phoenician immigrant, teaching in a borrowed porch in a city that had lost every military advantage it ever possessed, built the philosophical system that would eventually govern the Roman Empire. Athens did not build this by design. It built it by accumulation, layer by layer, school by school, argument by argument, over a century and a half of intellectual production that continued precisely because the military pressure had been removed and there was nothing left to do but think. In 86 BC, the Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla besieged and sacked Athens. Athens had backed the wrong side in a conflict between Rome and Mithridates of Pontus. Sulla was not merciful. He cut down the sacred groves of the Academy and the Lyceum for timber to build siege equipment. He sacked the city. He took the library's collection back to Rome. It was the most direct military destruction Athens had suffered since the Persians burned the Acropolis in 480 BC. It was also, in the terms that actually mattered, completely irrelevant to Athens' survival. Because the philosophical schools rebuilt. Because the intellectual reputation was not stored in the timber of the groves. And because the Romans who had just destroyed Athens immediately recognized that Athens was the place their children needed to be educated. Cicero studied in Athens in 79 BC, 7 years after Sulla's sack. He described the experience of walking where Plato had walked, where Socrates had argued, as producing a peculiar emotional weight, the sense of standing inside a space that had generated history. Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC by men who justified the act in the language of Roman republicanism, a political framework derived almost entirely from Athenian democratic theory, transmitted through Cicero's reading of Plato and Aristotle. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, visited Athens in 21 BC and was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. He gave the city special privileges and tax exemptions. He treated it not as a conquered province, but as a living institution whose goodwill was worth purchasing. The mechanism was fully operational. The city that had lost its military power 6 centuries before, Augustus's visit was receiving tribute from the most powerful empire in the Western world, not by threat, but by reputation. The software was billing the hardware. It had been doing it for 300 years. And the billing had not stopped. In 2009, Greece opened the Acropolis Museum at the base of the hill, one of the most technically sophisticated archaeological museums in the world, built partly as an argument. The argument is this: the Parthenon marbles removed by Lord Elgin between 1801 and 1812 and sold to the British Museum belong in Athens, in a purpose-built facility, reunited with the fragments that remain in Greece. The British Museum's counter-argument is that the marbles are better preserved in London, and that their global accessibility in a world-class institution serves the broader public interest. Both arguments are, in their different ways, about the same question: who has custody of the intellectual infrastructure that Athens created? It is a question Thucydides would have recognized immediately. It is a property dispute about an idea. The Elgin marbles debate is not an archaeological argument. It is the longest-running demonstration of the thesis this episode has been making, that what Athens built was so durable, so foundational, so genuinely irreplaceable that powerful institutions are still fighting over who gets to claim proximity to it too, and a half millennia after the city that built it was militarily defeated. Meanwhile, the software runs without interruption. Every law school in the world teaches Aristotelian logic as the foundation of legal reasoning. Every democratic constitution on earth derives its structural vocabulary from Athenian political theory, filtered through Rome, filtered through Enlightenment philosophy, but traceable, link by link, back to the assembly that met on the Nix Hill above the Agora. The United States Constitution's separation of powers derives from Montesquieu's reading of Aristotle's Politics. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights derives from Stoic philosophy, the philosophy of a Phoenician immigrant who opened a school in a borrowed porch in a defeated city. A student named Zeno from Cyprus, who could not vote in Athens because he was not a citizen, built the philosophical framework that 2,000 years later became the legal foundation of international human rights law. The Athenians who executed Socrates for corrupting the youth built the system that made that kind of disagreement not only possible but productive. Athens did not survive because its ideas were right. It survived because its ideas were generative. They produced more ideas, in more people, across more centuries, than any comparable intellectual investment in the ancient world. The silver ran out, the ships rotted, the walls fell. The arguing has not stopped for a single century since. Athens built 2 things. The first was physical: a port, a fleet, walls connecting the two, and the silver mines that paid for all of it. This system made Athens the dominant power in the Aegean for 70 years. It was dismantled by its enemies in a single campaign season. The second was institutional, a set of practices for generating, arguing about, organizing, and transmitting knowledge. Academies, schools, the habit of public argument, the infrastructure of disagreement. This system was never dismantled. Not by Sparta, which tore down the walls, not by Sulla, which burned the groves, not by the Ottoman Empire, which governed Athens for 4 centuries and left the Parthenon a mosque and then an ammunition depot, which a Venetian cannonball destroyed in 1687, not by Lord Elgin, who took the marbles, not by German bombs in 1941, which fell on the city that the marbles had left. The software survived all of it, because software does not live in stone. The word Themistocles understood was silver. The word Pericles understood was empire. The word Socrates understood was, and he would insist this is the only one that matters, knowledge. He was executed for teaching it too publicly. His student conquered the known world spreading it. And the city that killed him has been collecting on his work ever since. Athens did not survive because it was powerful. It survived because it built something more durable than power. It built the habit of asking why power exists at all. And no army in 25 centuries has found a way to make that question stop being asked.